I think I've done this exercise before, but I don't really care. Quickly, name a non-square SNES RPG. I'm sure the popular answers are Mario RPG, Earthbound, Breath of Fire, maybe even Soul Blazer or Illusion of Gaia. But have any of you thought about this week's focus, Arcana? I doubt it. It never hits any underrated gem lists. Hell, it hardly ever gets talked about at all now, does it? The only reason I know of the game at all is due to the time I spent as a teenager exposing myself to a world of emulation on my 28K modem to play games that I had never knew existed, and of those, primarily RPGs. Ever since my friend Greg let me borrow his copy of what we now know as Final Fantasy VI, I was hooked on the genre, at least back then. So much so that the very first game I bought when I got my Retron 5 was Final Fantasy VI. Modern RPGs don't hook me in as much as the 8 and 16-bit games did, but I'm getting seriously off topic. Arcana is the story of an elemental card summoner named Rooks, and his quest to take down the evil goddess Rumsala, along with a few of her cronies, before she fully resurrects and goes completely crazy on the world. Of course, there's plenty of other story here, such as a lengthy optional intro on how Rumsala was imprisoned in the first place, the king's daughters disappearing, the mysterious circumstances concerning Rook's father, and so on. Not a lot of it has any real bearing on the main game's story, which is honestly kind of hard to follow. The translation of the game feels sort of shoddy. Story scenes are kind of sparse, and every time one popped up, it felt like important details were getting skipped over. Or to sum it up a bit differently, the game's story is all presented like a Cliff's Notes version of the real thing, with you expected to purchase a 500-page novel to fully understand things like Rook's family history, who this douchebag Ariel is in the beginning of the game that Rooks dislikes but helps anyway, and an explanation on the whole elemental card summoning profession. In fact, cards play a central role in the game overall. The entire game's presentation is actually based on it. The characters, enemies, and so on are presented as cards. In battle, your elemental spirits and enemies will tear when defeated. You can find and purchase cards that can be thrown at your enemies to do different types of damage. It's fairly unique for the time. Gameplay for Arcana is simple to understand dungeon crawler featuring turn-based battles. Although the party will always consist of at least Rooks and his elemental partner, up to 2 other party members may join: Tifa, Axes, Darwin, and Sarah. These party members come and go at specific party points. The biggest issue is that when they leave, it's usually right before a boss battle, forcing Rooks to fight it semi-alone. And when these other party members rejoin your team, they are empty-handed. You literally would either need to evacuate the dungeon you are currently in to get them geared up, or would have to know that they are joining beforehand so you can purchase equipment ahead of time. And shops don't tell you what stuff is better than others, so you'll just have to go off of the more expensive swords are sharper mentality. At least the game tells you who can equip what, denoted by the letters at the bottom of the shop screen. Anyway, back to the combat. The command screen may look intimidating at first, but you'll come to understand all of the options quickly, with the most important ones being attack, magic, and call. Call is a bit misleading, as it simply swaps out your current elemental for any others that you may have found. The element system actually feels a bit underutilized. Every enemy has a different colored border, signifying which element they belong to. Although you can take advantage of this, the bonuses are marginal. Most characters get spells simply named attribute with a number, but without going into the magic screen outside of combat and viewing the description, you'd never know what the spell is supposed to be the most useful against. In addition, the elementals you have in your party feel like nothing but punching bags for the enemy to hit. Physical attacks are so weak, it's almost not worth the effort of using them, and the magic, although useful, can drain your MP quickly, as magic spells in the game are extremely expensive to cast, making you either save your MP for those vital healing spells, or spend that hard-earned gold on flasks to rejuvenate it. The other option is to spend gold on the stat boosting items. This is a nice optional way of supplementing those hard-earned level ups. I keep getting sidetracked. Back to the elementals. Not only do they attack weakly, but they lack defense as well. Thankfully, unlike the rest of your group, the elementals regain their life and magic pools naturally as you stroll around in the dungeons. If things get a bit too hairy for them, You can opt to fight without them active as well, with the obvious trade-off being that enemies can now focus their attacks on the main characters. The biggest catch to that is this. If any member of the party other than an elemental falls, the game is immediately over. There are no continues, so you would have to restart from the last point you saved from. Oh, and you can also only save in the towns, not at all in the dungeons. This is a bit of a problem if you accidentally stumble into a boss and die, as replaying dungeons that you've spent quite a bit of time in kinda sucks. Dungeons themselves are fairly large in nature and are, of course, maze-like in design. They are presented in a 3D view, which I've always loved in games. Thankfully, a map is automatically generated in-game, brought up from the menu screen. On the larger stages, you might run into issues figuring out where the exit was, simply because you cannot scroll the map, but this isn't usually an issue. The actual issue is that you'll probably be bringing up the map often. This is because there are absolutely no landmarks or defining traits to distinguish where you are. Everything on a floor looks identical to everything else. Not only does this make navigation difficult, but it also makes the game look, well, boring. In fact, the only pleasant graphics that I can recall were some of the forest levels, the towns, and the enemy designs. Even though the overall look of the game is bland, at least all of the enemies, including their attacks, are animated, which is a surprising contrast to games like Final Fantasy VI, in which the enemies are all static images. On the other hand, everything has a very choppy feel to it. The aforementioned enemy animations seem like they are missing huge chunks of animation frames, and as you are traversing the dungeons, the screen travels at probably 5 frames per second. It's nice to have the enemies seem alive, but at the same time, a smoother presentation is more preferred, at least in my book. And you'll be seeing these enemies a lot. The encounter rate feels abnormally high, and there aren't really a ton of different enemies that you'll be fighting. Instead, there's just a lot of simple pellet swaps. The only reason why you'll know that you'll be fighting harder enemies is because they start dealing out increased amounts of damage, so much so that you'll be leaning harder on those healing spells. At least once you start earning enough money, you can purchase those stat increases that I talked about. This wasn't something you saw a lot of in the era, and it's a welcome option, especially if you have a bunch of money and are struggling in a dungeon. I ended up purchasing a bunch of max MP increases just to give myself a better pool of which to cast those healing spells, as again, spells are not cheap to use. The music of the game isn't really anything you'll probably remember, but the combat music and boss music is pleasant enough. The boss theme especially has that frantic, almost metal sounding feel. The village song isn't so bad either, with a peaceful touch to it, and each dungeon typically has its own track, but sadly, none of the dungeons are really memorable. There is a couple other small things I want to note. For one, is that Kirby? Both games were developed by HAL, so I wouldn't be surprised if Kirby did manage to squeeze himself into another HAL game. In addition to that, there's a pretty gruesome scene later in the game where one of the game's bad guys lays in a puddle of blood. I found this to be highly unusual, considering Nintendo wasn't normally a fan of any violent scenes like this in their games, at least not early on in the SNES life. Arcana isn't a game that gets talked about often, and I honestly don't see that changing anytime soon. Between the drab visuals, the frustratingly difficult to follow story, and excessive battle encounters, Arcana can sometimes feel like a chore to really sit down, play, and enjoy, but it's definitely doable. It's also not anywhere near the worst RPG I've ever played. If you're a fan of turn-based 16-bit RPGs, Arcana might be worth your time. It's a solid experience, but be prepared to get into battles every 5 seconds. Final score? 5 out of 7. This is Reaper. Happy fragging.